comes to the film Midas, man, I'm going to be 100% honest and say I actually really enjoyed it for a whole matter of reasons. Firstly, I really enjoyed learning about Brian Epstein as a person. I like that he had some bits before he was a Beatles manager, seeing him running his family's store, and we're seeing he's using his initiative and knowledge of what is currently going on in pop culture with rock and roll music being the new thing, and decides to start selling those records, helping the business, making more money, and getting closer connections with those in the music industry, which I thought really shows that from early stages he was already showing that managerial experience even before meeting the Beatles. When it comes to that, I really loved seeing the passion and love he instantly had for the Beatles when he saw them first perform, and it makes so much sense as to why he would go through putting his blood, sweat and tears into just getting them signed, and all the other struggles, as he really did believe that they were the next big thing, even if they didn't believe it themselves. I like that in this film there's a few bits of history which they somewhat reveal, as it's probably not known in the lore of the Beatles' history, and these little bits may have went unnoticed, at least for Brian. The first one that comes to mind is when most people would assume that the Beatles finally got the contract with EMI, but they were sceptical until George Martin convinced them otherwise, because he got on with the Beatles very well. That is not the case. Brian was able to get an audition contracted for George Martin specifically. He just wanted the paperwork so he could say that he got a contract with EMI, and luckily his bluff was not called when George Martin met the Beatles and was very much impressed by them, and George Martin was able to make the sound that we get to hear today. Another bit is Brian Epstein had the unfortunate position of having to fire Pete Best, but whilst doing so he did offer him the opportunity to be in another band or just help in general for music career and stuff like that. These offers were rejected by Pete Best out of anger and possibly ego, which completely makes sense. When it comes to this film, the main thing it touches upon is Brian's sexuality and the difficulty he had being a homosexual in a homophobic time, that being the 1960s, as homosexuality was illegal. So any sort of pleasure he wanted to get, he would have to do it on the sly, which is a real dangerous thing, as you could be possibly attacked in quite an unimaginable way. And what's even more sad is he couldn't even go to the police about it, as, like I said, it was illegal for him to be gay, so he'd be locked up as well. What's really sad is it leaves him with two options. If he does have a partner, he has to hide his love away and just pray no one outs him, or he's got to pretend to be something he's not. And this is the sad thing, is we see this happen throughout the film, with Brian getting into all sorts of situations, even being robbed for just minimal items to quite huge amounts of money, and he cannot even go to the law as they would not be on his side. On to a lighter part of the film, I thought the way they tackled the Beatles adaptations from the actors, it was a very different approach, at least in my eyes, as we see them as quite childish and to an extent obnoxious type of people. But at the same time they did have that raw talent which Brian so desperately wanted the whole world to see, and I think that is what this film is trying to show us. Yes, they were obnoxious, but they did have a raw talent. Throughout the film, what is quite interesting to know is Brian's addictions to pills increases as they become more famous because of tour cancellations and negative press. We could see it really having a toll on him, having to kind of take substances to somewhat stay okay. And it's really interesting to learn about this, is because we know from the Beatles they always had to deal with this type of situation with tour cancellation and that, and we have heard it from their perspective, but we never heard it from Brian. It's just fascinating to know that he was also going through it, probably even worse than they were. The last thing which I really did enjoy about this film is the film ratio, as very early on you notice it is quite small, and this could be for two reasons. Either it's a interpretation or representation of how film ratio was back then in the 60s, or it's a metaphor for the fame for the Beatles as well as Brian Epstein, as they were somewhat known but not big. And as the film goes on, when they really do make it big, the film ratio does change, which I didn't initially notice until very later. Again, I think that could be a metaphor for how big the Beatles became. But the film ratio at first is very obvious, but as you get into the film, when it changes, it's kind of surprising really to see it sort of change. When it comes to the ending of this film, I'll say it's bittersweet, as Brian has been informed that the Beatles no longer want to tour, which makes him feel quite useless as a manager, as that is all he was doing at that point, was just getting them to tour, getting them to certain places to make fame last a bit longer. But with this news, it really crushed him. He did his best to make sure the Beatles would still have this big legacy. He was able to get the Beatles to perform to the entire world via television, and then sadly he felt like he could do no more and decided to take a vacation, and that is when we find out he died off screen, which is quite sad. When it comes to criticisms of this film, I do have a few. The first one being, I felt like they pandered too much to the Beatles fan base, on the sense of seeing the Beatles perform a bit too many times. I understand that the average Beatles fans who are going to watch this and they want to see the Beatles perform do understand that, but at the same time, this is not about the Beatles necessarily. This is about Brian Epstein and the struggles he went to get the Beatles signed, and I think that's what Beatle fans like myself are more interested in. The average fan, if they want to see the Beatles perform, they can go on YouTube, or watch Backbeat for example. There's many other films that see them perform. The scenes went on for too long in my eyes. The second criticism is, even though this is about how he made the Beatles, it'd be nice to learn a bit more about Brian, as we only learn from 62 onwards, and we don't learn about his early childhood or even his younger 20s, as it is quite a read if you go on his Wikipedia page, but sadly the stuff that is on there we don't get to see being adapted, which is really disappointing. Overall, it's really interesting to watch this film to learn so much about Brian Epstein, seeing the blood, sweat and tears he put in to not only getting the Beatles signed, but to get them big in the US as well. It's also quite sad to see what Brian had to go through in order to get pleasure as a gay person in that particular time period. But at the same time, this film just shows exactly why they call Brian the fifth Beatle. Is this film good? I'm going to be honest and say it's really good. Rating wise, I'm going to be honest and say it's an 8 out of 10. Now when it comes to would I rewatch it, I've got nothing against this film per se. I just feel like it's not amazing, but it's definitely not terrible. I think it's definitely in the top 5 of Beatle movies. Maybe later I will go back and rewatch this. When it comes to recommendations, sad to say, Brian Epstein rarely gets any time in any of the Beatle adaptation films, and this is the one of a kind. The only adaptation I have seen of Brian is in a parody version of the film The Ruttles. They did a very funny parody of the guy, and I think if you like this, you might want to watch that as well. When it comes to learning about the Beatles before Hamburg, I definitely recommend the book The Man Who Sold the Beatles Away by Alan Williams, their former manager, who we do see in this film, played by Eddie Izzard, who gets to say the infamous quote,
"They're good musicians. I'll give them that. But if I were you, I wouldn't touch them with a fucking barge pole."
That's another one. I would also recommend, if you just want to learn about the Beatles in Hamburg, I would recommend the film Backbeat, as you get to learn about the Beatles, about the strained relationship they somewhat had with Stuart Sutcliffe and their evolution from Hamburg onwards. But the film itself is more about Stuart Sutcliffe and his love for Astrid. And then if you're just wanting to learn about the Beatles, not really wanting to see adaptations, just a documentary, I've got a few to recommend. Anthology for the entirety of the Beatles from 1958 to 1970, and maybe a bit more if I recall. If you want to see a particular time period, I definitely recommend Get Back, the miniseries on Disney Plus. It is a great watch, fantastic. It's really cool to see them and how they made that particular album. And then lastly, if you just want a kind of a short version of the history of the Beatles, you gotta go to Complete Beatles. It is a fantastic documentary, and it is the very first one to be made after John Lennon's passing. Those are my recommendations. This has been my review for Midas Man. Thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed, please like and subscribe, but most importantly, thank you and have a nice day.